an inheritance of scorn. The wrought iron gates of the Hawthorne estate stood as a sentinel to a legacy of old money and quiet power. As the sleek black sedan purred up the long, winding driveway, Julian Hawthorne leaned back, a slow exhale misting the window. The sight of his childhood home stirred a complex brew of nostalgia and the undeniable weight of his family's expectations. It had been years since he'd set foot here, years spent forging his own empire, a success entirely separate from the Hawthorne name. Now, he was returning not just as a man of influence, but as a husband. Beside him, Isabella sat poised, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the fine leather of the car's interior. She was a woman of sharp elegance and sharper expectations, thrilled to have married into one of America's wealthiest families. But as the sprawling estate came into view, her lips thinned. It was grand, certainly, but to her, it felt antiquated. She'd envisioned sleek lines and modern luxury, not the classic, old-world charm that now lay before them. Julian noticed her subtle shift in expression, but said nothing. He had long learned that when it came to matters of taste, Isabella's opinions were best left unchallenged. As the car drew to a halt, the estate staff, a well-drilled line of impeccable professionalism, waited to receive their returning master. Julian recognized a few familiar faces, the loyal old retainers who had served his family for decades. But his gaze searched for one person in particular. Before he could exit the car, the grand oak doors swung open, and two figures emerged. His Aunt Eleanor, a woman whose regal bearing was matched only by her keen, assessing eyes, and his older brother, Marcus, whose smirk was a welcoming mix of affection and mischief. Julian stepped out first, offering a hand to Isabella. She accepted it with the practiced grace of a woman who had attended 1,000 high society galas. The moment her heels clicked on the stone pavement, her gaze swept over the assembled staff, a flicker of detached curiosity in her eyes. "Julian, it's good to have you back," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a cool authority. She glanced at Isabella, offering a brief nod. "And this must be your wife." Isabella extended her hand, her lips forming a perfect, practiced smile. "A pleasure to meet you both. Julian has spoken of you often." Eleanor's handshake was brief, a silent evaluation. Marcus, on the other hand, took her hand lightly. "Welcome to the Hawthorne estate, Isabella. I hope you like it here." She smiled, an unreadable glint in her eyes. "It's certainly impressive." Julian's eyes, however, had found their target. Standing slightly apart from the other staff was Mabel. Years had touched her, but she remained just as he remembered, dignified, strong, her face lined with the passage of time, but her presence unchanged. She stood with the quiet grace that had always defined her, dressed in a simple yet impeccable uniform. There was a warmth in her eyes that made Julian's chest tighten. "Mabel," he said, taking a step toward her. Her face lit up, a knowing, affectionate smile on her lips. "My boy," she said, her voice steady, but full of feeling. "Welcome home." Without a second thought, Julian closed the distance and wrapped his arms around her. She smelled of lavender and familiarity, of comfort and childhood memories. She patted his back lightly, the same way she had when he was a boy seeking solace. Isabella watched the exchange with something close to surprise. She had never seen Julian so unguarded. He was a man of measured gestures, of calculated interactions. But here, with this old servant, he seemed entirely open. When they finally pulled apart, Mabel took a small step back, studying him. "You've grown into a fine man." "I hope so," Julian chuckled. "Though I imagine you'd still scold me if I deserved it." "I would," she admitted, a twinkle in her eye. Marcus's gaze flickered to Isabella. He saw the barely concealed confusion on her face, the way her lips pressed together. He knew trouble was brewing. Julian turned back to Isabella, his hand resting on her back. "Mabel, this is my wife, Isabella." Mabel nodded politely. "Welcome, ma'am." Isabella hesitated, then offered a small, practiced smile. "Thank you. It's lovely to meet you." The handshake that followed was brief. Isabella's grip was cool and fleeting, her gaze detached. Mabel's expression shifted, ever so slightly, before it returned to its quiet composure. "Well, "That was an interesting introduction," Marcus murmured to Julian, just loud enough for him to hear. Julian gave him a sharp look, but Marcus only grinned. As they moved into the house, Isabella's gaze swept over the old-world grandeur, the high ceilings, the dark mahogany furniture, the ornate tapestries. It felt more like a museum than a home. Julian, however, felt something entirely different. This was where he had grown up, and at the center of so many of those memories stood Mabel. The quiet hum of the estate's activity settled as evening drew near. Dinner was being prepared, the scent of roasting meat mingling with the crisp evening air. Julian found Isabella standing by the grand piano, her fingers trailing idly across its polished surface. "You've barely said a word since we got here," he said, watching her carefully. She turned slightly, her expression unreadable. "Just taking it all in. Your home is traditional. That's a polite way of saying outdated, isn't it?" She didn't deny it. "It has history, I'll give it that, and a certain charm." A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Mabel stepped inside. "Dinner is ready," she announced. Julian nodded. "Thank you, Mabel." Isabella remained still for a moment, then offered a small smile. "That was fast. Your staff is efficient." Mabel inclined her head slightly. "We do our best, ma'am." Julian didn't miss Isabella's hesitation before she followed him from the room, a subtle, distant coolness he had not seen before. The dining room was set beautifully. The family was already seated by the time they arrived. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her eyes filled with quiet scrutiny. Marcus, ever the spectator, leaned back in his chair with a hint of amusement. Mabel, as she had done for years, ensured everything was in place before settling into the chair that had always been hers. Isabella noticed. For a moment, she said nothing, her expression carefully neutral. But when she spoke, her voice was light, almost playful, though the words carried a sharper edge. "I wasn't expecting the staff to dine with the family." A heavy silence fell. Julian's hand tightened on his fork. Eleanor's gaze sharpened. Marcus leaned back, amused. Mabel, however, did not react outwardly. "I've been with the Hawthorne family for a long time, ma'am. This has always been the way of things." Isabella's head tilted slightly. "Interesting. I suppose every family has its own customs." "Mabel is more than just staff, Isabella," Julian said, his voice measured. "She practically raised me." "Of course," Isabella said smoothly. "That's why it's different. I'm just not used to it." The conversation shifted, but every now and then, Julian caught Isabella's eyes flicking toward Mabel, studying her in that cool, assessing way. By the time dinner ended, the air between them was quiet, but no less significant. The morning sun spilled through the windows of the Hawthorne estate, casting golden beams across the polished floors. Julian, unable to shake the tension from the previous night, decided to take a walk. He wandered toward the sitting room and paused just outside the doorway. Inside, Isabella stood near a side table, inspecting one of the framed photographs. Mabel was beside her, adjusting the curtains with her usual unhurried grace. "This house has so much history," Isabella said, holding up a photograph of a young Julian, no more than 7, with a book far too big for his hands. Mabel's warm eyes watching over him. "I suppose certain things remain unchanged." "Yes, Mum," Mabel replied with quiet dignity. Isabella's lips curved slightly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I imagine some things could use updating, like these old portraits, for example. They give the house such a museum-like feel. Wouldn't you agree? They are a part of the family's history." "Mum," Mabel replied, her expression neutral. "I'll have to talk to Julian about it," Isabella said, almost as an afterthought. "A home should reflect its owners, after all." Julian chose that moment to step inside. "Some things are worth holding on to," he replied simply. Isabella's smile didn't waver. "Of course, darling. I was just saying how certain traditions can be charming, but others, well, they can make a house feel stuck in time." She left the room moments later, and Julian turned to Mabel. "She get used to things," he said, though the words felt like an excuse. Mabel gave him a small, knowing smile. "Change can take time." At breakfast, Isabella was in a particularly good mood, speaking animatedly about plans for the day. Marcus smirked over his coffee cup. Then, it happened. A sudden movement, a slight flick of the wrist, and a glass of red wine toppled over. The crimson liquid splashed across the pristine tablecloth and directly onto Mabel's uniform. "Oh, dear," Isabella said, her voice light with mocked concern. "How clumsy of me." Mabel did not flinch. She simply took a step back, dabbing at the stain. "It's all right, ma'am. Accidents happen." "Yes," Isabella said, her unreadable gaze fixed on Mabel. "They do." Julian sat in silence, something cold settling in his chest. He should have said something, but the words didn't come. He simply watched as Mabel, with quiet dignity, excused herself from the room. The afternoon passed in a strange, heavy quiet. Julian found himself in his study, trying to work, but the memory of the spilled wine and Isabella's smile haunted him. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Eleanor stepped inside. "You've been hiding in here all day," she said, her voice calm but pointed. "Just trying to get some work done, or trying to avoid what's happening under your own roof." Eleanor took a seat across from him. What happened at breakfast was not an accident. Isabella's behavior toward Mabel has been disgraceful. Isabella doesn't understand how things work here. Julian tried to explain. "She's still adjusting." Eleanor shook her head. "That's a weak excuse. Humiliating a woman who has dedicated her life to this family is another." She stood, smoothing her dress. "Mabel won't complain, but that doesn't mean she isn't hurt. And if you continue to stay silent, Nicholas, you'll regret it." The next evening, dinner was a much quieter affair. The air was strained. Isabella, however, was as poised as ever. Just as dinner was ending, she struck again. As Mabel reached to refill Isabella's glass, Isabella let out an exaggerated gasp and jerked her arm, causing the glass to tip over once more. This time, the dark liquid splashed across Mabel's hand and the front of her uniform. "Oh, dear," Isabella murmured. "I really must be more careful." Mabel froze for a fraction of a second, then straightened, dabbing at the stain. "It's all right, Mum," she said, her voice steady. Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. "That is enough," she said, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. "I don't know what kind of behavior is acceptable in your world, Isabella, but in this house, we do not treat the people who raised us like trash." Isabella's lips parted in feigned innocence, but then a soft laugh escaped her. "It was an accident. There's no need to overreact." Marcus finally spoke, his voice laced with disdain. "You've got quite the talent for accidents, don't you?" Isabella's gaze turned to Julian, searching his eyes, daring him to take a side. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled and reached for his wine glass. "Let's not turn this into something it's not," he said, his voice measured, neutral. Eleanor's expression darkened. Marcus shook his head. Isabella smiled, satisfied. Julian took a slow sip of his wine, but it tasted bitter on his tongue. Later that night, Julian found himself wandering the halls. He didn't realize where he was going until he stopped in front of Mabel's quarters. The door was slightly ajar. He knocked lightly. "Come in," Mabel's voice said. He stepped inside. The room was small but comfortable, filled with little pieces of her life. Mabel was seated by the window, looking out at the darkened estate. She turned to him with that same quiet, understanding gaze. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I've been through worse, my boy," she said, a tired smile on her face. "I don't know what to do." "You already know," she said softly. "You're just afraid of doing it." She reached out, placing a gentle hand over his. "You were always a good boy. I know you still are." She lowered her hand. "But if you don't make a choice soon, you'll lose something far more important than your pride." The next day, Julian entered his bedroom. Isabella was at her vanity, removing her earrings. She met his gaze in the mirror, a slight curve on her lips. "I was wondering when you'd finally come to your senses," she murmured. "Pack your things," Julian said, his voice steady, final. "You're leaving." A short, breathless laugh escaped her lips. "You're serious?" "Yes." She rose slowly, her eyes narrowing. "All of this," she said, "over a maid?" Over Mabel, he corrected. Over you. Over everything you've done. Everything I allowed you to do. Isabella's expression darkened. You'll regret this, Julian. No, he said, shaking his head. For the first time, I won't. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, her breath sharp, her fury palpable. He walked out of the house and into the cold night air. The weight that had settled on his shoulders was lifting, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like himself again. But there was still one more thing to do. He had to make things right.